Hey everyone, Brandon and Kyle today at the Kabuki Strength Lab, and today we're going to show you how to properly do the split squat. And Kyle and I were discussing this, and we might shoot a video on this after this, but the split squat is in fact not a unilateral exercise despite the common recommendations of doing split squats for unilateral strength. We assume that the split squat is a unilateral drill because one foot is placed in front of the other. However, unilateral by definition means affecting only one side of the body. For a true unilateral exercise, we would have to have this other leg off the ground because in a split squat or a lunge, we still have a very significant eccentric load on that back leg, which makes this not, in fact, a unilateral exercise. Anyway, kind of a side note for the video today, but we might shoot a video on that in the future. We're going to show you 3 progressions of the split squat, and we're going to show you 3 faults so that you can mix up your training and hopefully choose the right one for you. We're going to show the first one in an actual lunge stance, and the reason that we like the lunge stance is because Kyle's going to have the greatest opportunity to avoid twisting his hips at the bottom, which is our first fault. First fault is twisting the hips either going down or immediately at the bottom, and people are going to do that to try and avoid end range hip extension on the back leg or even hip flexion on the front leg. The second fault we're going to note, and go ahead and get down to this, Kyle, leave your hips kind of back a little bit from this. The second fault that we're going to see is missing end range hip extension on that bottom leg from Kyle. Ideally, we would have near full hip flexion on our front leg and full hip extension on that bottom leg in the split squat, assuming your feet are reasonably spaced apart. And the final one that we're going to see is an excessive anterior pelvic tilt by people trying to stay very tall in the drill. Your split squat should almost mimic your squat pattern in terms of your torso fold proportion, and we call that the hip fold proportion. That's going to be dictated by the capsular structure of your pelvis, as well as femur length and probably a couple other factors. But your split squat, go ahead and do it again for me, Kyle, should have a reasonable degree of torso forward lean depending on how your hips are actually built. If you try to stay up tall the entire time, you will never reach end range hip extension on that bottom leg, and you will probably end up with some achy knees after doing this drill. So a progression from doing it in the static lunge position is actually rear foot elevated on the bench. And the reason we say that this is a progression is because if we look at Kyle's leg and the relationship between where his knee and hip is, it's actually a slightly bigger range of motion, therefore a slightly greater eccentric load on that quad in the rear foot elevated split squat. It's also more challenging for Kyle to manage his hip rotation because he's not playing it on the ground with this foot. So it's a slight progression. It's not that different from the static lunge, but it is slightly different in terms of the bottom leg, in terms of how much hip extension Kyle could potentially get and how much eccentric loading is happening on that bottom leg. And the final progression that we're going to see is an actual deficit split squat. And this is by far one of my favorite drills to target people's quads and hip structures in their maybe accessory type training. What you'll notice is Kyle's going to stand on a couple blocks, and these are maybe 4 inches in height. This is going to force Kyle into a very deep range of motion, and as we know, for a hypertrophic stimulus, we need a few things, and one of those is range of motion. So if we can get Kyle into a greater range of motion with the same amount of mechanical tension or more, he's probably gonna get a greater hypertrophic stimulus from this and gain greater mobility from the drill. And there's infinite ways you could load this. You could be with the barbell, it could be with the dumbbell, it could be with 2 dumbbells, it could be with a kettlebell in a goblet squat position. It really doesn't matter. All of those have slightly different benefits, and we're not gonna go into that today. Hopefully you can choose the one that fits you best and have a starting point of actually which one of these is going to fit you best. Anything to note there, Coach Kyle?
Loading movements. One of the biggest places we see problems is when athletes load movements. The faults we talked about, this gets surprisingly hard depending on which variation you're going off of. We can easily add too much weight too soon. It might look good, body weight. As soon as we add 20-pound dumbbells, 30, 40-pound dumbbells, we start to change the movement into something it's not. So most of the time these faults come out with too much loading, excessive loading in the movement.
Brandon and Kyle out.